I'll give you a quick introduction while you're getting set up. Robyn's based in Cambridge, has got very wide interest in archaeological scientific approaches to ancient environments, and in particular has published very extensively lots of wonderful work on ancient forests and fuel, and the economics of ancient fuel in particular, which I guess will be in the background to a lot of what she wants to say today. So, Robyn, all yours.
So, thank you for having me. I really didn't know how to tackle this in many ways, at what level to put it. And what I've decided to do is to explain more to ancient historians than to scientists and archaeologists what I do or what we do and why. So basically I'm going to talk about archaeobotany, but it gets called a range of things, and some pictures here. We're quite interested in olives and vines in the Roman and the sort of general historical periods. So I'm going to be using a few examples. But you can see pollen on the left there, and you've got a bit of olive charcoal, and of course we know what it looks like. So there are all sorts of names for archaeobotany, and depending on where you're from, it can be paleobotany or paleoecology. And if you're more located in North America, the paleo is the prefix. If you're more European, we tend to use the archaeo. But paleobotany in itself is an actual discipline, and it's looking at fossils and obviously geological time periods. So just wanted to explain that, because often you hear those words used, paleobotany and archaeobotany, as being sort of the same thing, and they're not entirely identical in my mind. We're mostly concerned with things that started happening when mankind or hominids started walking the earth, and prehistorical archaeology is obviously a little bit out of our interest area at the moment. But protohistoric time periods, where we've got early writing, symbology, we are interested in. And why do we want to constrain what time period? We don't necessarily want to, but scope and scale is very important when you're trying to put your results of whatever you've dug up into context. So if you're looking at botany, you can be looking at pollen, which is often poured over a time period that's thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, whereas an archaeological site usually in a historical period will tend to be a few hundred years or possibly 1,000 years. The other thing is, archaeobotanists often start their training as historians or perhaps as scientists or archaeologists, and they end up in botany. But it's quite important, the modern disciplines of botany and ecology, because they have some mores, disciplines, that is very useful to us. We have to work a lot with approximate data in the field, and Dimitri's done me a great big favour explaining how that can be limiting and how it can really change your interpretation. And so it's quite important for people to read modern ecological texts and modern botany and biological texts, and listen and go to those kinds of informative lectures. So what is affecting archaeobotany? What things do we find in historical periods? So we have plants, obviously, and on different levels of scale, you've got the geology and the topography. You've got climate, and luckily lots of people before me have spoken a lot about this. Politics and land ownership can make quite a difference to where things are grown or how they're grown or how they're sold. And for my area of wood, for example, I have a contention that most of the Mediterranean cultures either had lots of wood and therefore were in a good position to build ships and buildings and fuel their industries, or they didn't have a lot of wood, in which case they were at a great disadvantage, and they had to either conquer somewhere, somehow, places that had a lot of wood. So a good comparison is Greece and Italy. So Italy has and still has a great climate, a great fertile environment, and historically and now still has a well-treed environment, relatively speaking. Greece, on the other hand, never had it terribly easy because it is a less fertile area with less rainfall, And so in its time, Greece generally had to go elsewhere to get trees for ships, for example. So I won't harbour on this too long. I'm going to be drilling down to mostly the lowest level of how we think about archaeobotany, particularly in the historical period. So we're quite interested in the ancient written sources, and the agronomists, people would be familiar with Theophrastus, Cato, Columella, Varro, but there are others, obviously, and they're incidental mentions. Of these, well, they've been well and truly analysed, and I think well summarised by Meigs in particular. And the secondary sources are very helpful, particularly modern secondary sources, so Grove and Rackham. And I really like Alain Bresson's Greek economy book. But we do have a few problems with ancient historians in the past, like Veal, J.D. Hughes, who tended to focus very heavily on anecdotal mentions of things in the ancient sources, as does Lucas Tommen in his more recent book. And so it's quite important when you're reading something to try to understand the background of the person who's written it. And if it's truly only a historical analysis without any of the science added, then it's probably going to be inaccurate in a number of ways. Why do we care about the environmental base? Well, the geology and the geography obviously make a difference to fertility. If you've got volcanoes around, your soil fertility is going to be good. I'm going to talk a bit more about climate versus weather, because we toss this word climate around a fair bit, and what does that mean, and can archaeobotany tell us more than just using pollen studies, for example. But for a long time, there's been quite a lot of prejudice against an emphasis on natural climate or natural environmental things like geology. There's been this environmental deterministic idea that the actual environment, the Earth, was less of an influence than what humans were doing. And I think now there's a bit of a swing away from that, and respect for all kinds of contributions. And in some time periods, Mother Nature makes a bigger difference to what's going on and kind of forces humans to change. And in other times, humans really mess with the environment or mould it the way they want to. So archaeobotany has been stuck in making lists of plants, particularly foods and trees for fuel. But we're kind of moving on from there now, and we're trying to do more modelling and look at productivity, carrying capacity, and so on. But you can't do that in isolation. So our historical sources. I won't sort of labour on about J.D. Hughes, but if anybody does want to ask some questions, he did recently, about 2013, defend his position, and he stuck to it and didn't do that terribly well, basically using anecdotal data to say, well, here's the Romans have deforested the world. But there's no real evidence for true deforestation by the Romans. There's no really massive deforestation until the medieval period. There are anecdotal and, of course, location-specific places where the Romans deforested, and so did other people. But we want to be careful about talking about that, defining what deforestation is. Removal of trees altogether, or is it, if you've planted and cultivated trees, is that deforestation, or is it just another form of afforestation? So when we look at the historical sources, we do get some classical problems. So phagos is not the same as Fagus sylvatica. The Greek for phagos has been translated since time immemorial into phagus, meaning beech, but it actually means oak, and Meigs is very good explaining that. We've got geography issues insofar as the time, the distance, and a wider perspective that we have now didn't really exist back then, even though there was a lot of, understanding of nautical travel. We've got the historical sources, frescoes. Pompeii is terrific. This Lararium on the top there, that's a picture from the House of the Centenary. That's a lovely picture of Pompeii as a single cone. And that's quite interesting, because we now know when we look at Vesuvius, it's got a double cone. And so for a long time, people used to think perhaps that diagram was wrong. And then more recently, volcanology studies have explained it in detail. At the bottom, we've got a mosaic there. That's terrific because the detail is so high that all those species can be identified. But there's been a lot of speculation about the various frescoes that combine all sorts of plants together, and it's obviously a form of artistic expression where the optimal or most beautiful things are shown, not necessarily as they would appear seasonally, but all at once. And I think the classic one for a long time was there's a depiction somewhere of a date palm with dates on it in Pompeii. So people thought for ages that dates should grow in Pompeii, which of course they don't. When we think about archaeobotany, we do have to start with the geological, geomorphological base. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, mostly because other people have, but tree rings, dendrochronology, are really critical, and they give us 1 year at a time dating. And of course, you get sequences in different parts of Europe and connect them up. Unfortunately, the records in Italy itself are still fairly sparse, so we don't have enough tree ring data there yet. I want to encourage all ancient historians and all archaeologists, if they haven't already, to negotiate with pollen studies because they're critical to understanding the greater questions of climate. And one of the problems we have at the moment is that there are a lot of pollen studies done quite a long time ago where the dating was poor or very few dates were taken. And now we have better methods, and we can even go back to older cores if we still have them and redate. I won't talk about speleothems, don't need to. I will talk a bit more about isotopes, mainly because we do talk about it, but I'm not sure how many people actually understand how it works. So our environmental base, part 2, we're on a sort of more regional level, we need to understand ecology, so relationships between plants and animals in the environment. We have this word phytosociology, how trees and plants associate. And one of the things we often do is we look for groupings of plants that are perhaps suited to the climate. So if it's a very arid, dry, hot climate, then you look for a lot of evergreen plants. If it's a more moderate climate with more rainfall, you will expect what we call mesophilic or deciduous plants that need more damp and more water. So besides plants reflecting the climate is also reflected in plant structures. For example, you have in evergreen trees and waxier leaves, stronger cellular structures, and I guess things that resist the heat and resist breaking under the lack of water or a sudden surge of it. So, but all ecology, modern ecology ideas are not always helpful. So often repeated in pollen studies is this concept of the climate forest or the climate maximum tree forest, which now has been, I think, not everybody agrees with it. So the idea that if you're in the Mediterranean, your climax forest is necessarily some kind of evergreen forest, and that's what it always should end up being, unless humans interfere with it. I think we're gradually moving away from those fixed ideas. And the other problem we have is we tend to look at altitudinal representations of plants and animals a little bit too much through the lens of what's going on today, when in fact it's more than probable things existed a bit lower down, not only because the climate may have been a touch cooler, but just because we've ended up harvesting things so much they've just ended up further up the mountain, particularly with trees. And of course, we want to talk to, archaeobotanists want to talk to the zoologists because animals eat plants and certain animals need certain environments. So if you're finding Roman boar, for example, if the archaeozoologist is finding Roman boar, then you probably have forests nearby, or you need at least a certain amount of forest and greenery for such animals to survive. And so you're looking for correlations. Climate and weather is a bit of an issue for classical archaeologists and historians. So I call climate periods that are detectable perhaps greater than 100 years, and weather is what happened last week or perhaps the last 10 years. And one of the issues with the historical sources is they tend to record weather. They tend to record anecdotes about this amazing tree that flowered a certain way, or the fact that an olive tree was killed in a frost. And these are anecdotal, so we can't really say that's a discussion about climate. But more recently, we've had some great integrated studies, and not only the ones that Jed spoke about, but I like McCormick's work in particular, trying to synthesize things that were happening in the Roman period, in the Roman Empire, along with the various kinds of climate proxies. One of the things that's very interesting to me now is how much it seems that volcanic activity, and we know that solar flares change things as well, but volcanic activity in particular, if it's a decent kind of an eruption, the ash from that will block out the sunlight for quite a number of years, perhaps several years or even up to 10. And so perhaps the whole idea that the natural environment is somewhat deterministic is now more acceptable, because it's going to depend on the time frame and what's happening in the natural environment versus what's happening in the social human environment. So within archaeobotany itself, we're always looking at things a little bit with our eye or a low magnification lens, and that's mostly wood and seeds. But we do more of our work under a microscope, and here, for example, we've got some pine representations of pine. So the tree, good old stone pine, Pinus pinea, which we recognise throughout the Med, and on the bottom left corner there, we've got all the different parts of it. So the cone and the seeds and different aspects of the needles. The pollen for pine it's very common. It's very easy to identify as a pine pollen, harder to differentiate between the different pines. And in charcoal as well, it's quite hard to differentiate different kinds of pine one from the other. And then we also have these things called phytoliths down the bottom there. Phytoliths are the last part of an organic being that is left after you've kind of decayed and dissolved everything, either naturally or with chemicals. Silica bodies, they are, and these have been kind of reflected particular way in the microscope. And the shapes of these represent groups of different kinds of plants. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on phytoliths because it's a fairly new area, but the fact that we have it and it's a growing area is useful because it can provide a contrast to other data. So within archaeobotany itself, we've also got the very small elemental analytical archaeological sciences, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time later on isotopes. We have, when we do a pollen core, what we call non-pollen palaeomorphs, and across to the right there you can see pictures of foraminifera, which are little single-celled things that produce a kind of test, a shell if you like, and these are also very small, obviously, made of calcium carbonate. And different kinds will be benthic, that is, they live near the bottom of the water, or planktonic, they float around. And obviously you've got different ones for the marine area, which is most of them that we know about, but you've also got brackish and freshwater. So besides the pollens that help us define our environment, these help us define our microenvironments. So I'm not going to talk to you about all the different kinds of chemistry and science that can be done on charcoal and on seeds, but we are getting further with different kinds of study. For charcoal, we're starting to be able to tell the temperature that things were burnt at, and in particular tell the difference between a raw wood fire and a charcoal fuel fire. Now that's important because you use a lot more wood up from a forest if you make charcoal first and then transport that somewhere to be used as a fuel than if you just burn your raw wood in the first place. Genetics, usually on modern material, can tell us where a plant might have originated and how it might have moved. And I don't think I need to explain this because we've heard a lot about the genome of COVID-19, not always accurately, I might say, but the idea that it varies through time and space and becomes more complex and different, mutates the more it moves around is important. And olives have been something that we've been interested in. What's native, what's cultivated, and people measure the size of seeds and they measure growth rates and things. And we can tell a little bit with the genetics where things come from with olive, but we can't usually tell the difference between what we call oleaster or wild olive, which is usually cultivated olive that's just kind of gone back to nature. So when you see small pips and differently growing trees, it's usually because the olive that was cultivated has just been left alone. But cultivated olives are not, they don't reproduce sexually. They're always grown from cuttings and put on a rootstock. And it's the rootstock that's wild. So when you ignore a cultivated field of olives, basically the rootstock will take over and it will be vigorous, and then you'll get your small olives with poor, a poor recovery of the oil. So it's important to remember that wild olives do reproduce sexually, and cultivated olives are not permitted to do so, basically, because you want to clone them. So we do a lot of other soil and chemistry studies. I won't spend a lot of time on those, but from my point of view, from the archaeobotany point of view, we like to understand if dung is being used for fuel, for example, and there's quite a few people who started to look at what combinations of seeds and what kind of soil chemistry is involved there. And if we're looking at wells, well, we like wells because the preservation of anything wet that's kept wet all the time is much higher than something that's been exposed to air. But in particular, we might see in a well a high presence of phosphorus, so we can tell there are animals around. And this is the whole idea of we need to move beyond just making lists of our plants and finding out what other disciplines are doing and integrating. There's a lot of problems with preservation in archaeobotany. The best preservation is always the extreme form, either extremely wet or extremely dry, and preferably with little disturbance. But the most common is the charred materials. And obviously charcoal or charred anything, it's light, it's porous, it can be more easily moved around in the environment. So we need to be able to understand whether what we're actually looking at comes from the particular bucket of soil or context, as we call it, that we think it does. It's arrived and you've dug it up and found it there, but was that put there when that particular context was sealed? We've got some, these are samples from Palaeobotany, which is a site near Naples, and these mineralised lentils were in a drain, lovely preservation, and then we've got a nice charred Vicia faba, the most important bean. What are contexts? Well, we probably, sorry, I'm boring the archaeologists here, but we do need to understand what they are in terms of what we're collecting. And Dimitri's covered a fair bit of this, so I won't harbour it. But from the labour it, sorry. Primary contexts are often the ones that people are more interested in because that's where you find your jewellery, your glass, your ceramics, generally speaking. But for archaeobotanists, it's kind of a less useful thing, a primary context, because it'll just show the last use of something, a small amount of something usually. So if it's a wood, it might be the last burn event in a fire, or the last meal, perhaps. But secondary contexts where things have been redeposited, typically in drains, refuse areas, you're going to get an average representation of all of the consumption of the foods over that particular time period that the context represents. And that's much more useful to us. So tertiary, when things get moved around again, that kind of makes life a bit more complicated. But if you can date the context, that's good. I'm going to talk a bit more about dating soon, because in historical periods, we'll always try to rely on coins and ceramics and other forms of artifacts to date, and we can date within 50 years or even less sometimes. And that's very useful to us when we're talking about political periods, but it's not so useful when you're trying to model things at a wider level. We want to understand what the word taphonomy means. I hope all historians go away understanding what taphonomy means. So things are deposited by humans or nature, you know, as in Pompeii. And once they are deposited in the soil, they can be moved around or changed quite a lot, and not very much gets preserved. And if small creatures are crawling through the soil, then they will disturb things, move them away, up or down from the particular time period in which they should be located. So that can confuse us. And soil chemistry can change the preservation of things. So highly alkali or highly acid soils will change how much charcoal is preserved and may even destroy all the charcoal if you're unlucky, and more so with seeds. Talking a bit more about contexts and what we can do with archaeobotany now. In Pompeii, I've made a longish study of across the city about 4 major sites, but looked like they were owned by 11 different owners. So, but not at the 79 AD level, going down below that through the normal archaeology. And what I found is that ritual deposits with charcoal in them have a high diversity, representing all the fragrant or food associated woods that might have been put in that Roman deposit. Industrial deposits will have a very low diversity of wood and very high heat value woods. And general deposits, where we can't really tell what they are, they could be cooking, heating, reuse, you'll get a moderate diversity. And the form of small branches, coppice. One of the things in Pompeii that I see is that you know roughly what the wood is. You will be able to predict roughly what century it might come from. This is called biodating. So once you know a site very well, you can look to help the archaeobotany to help or to check or cross-check mistakes or differences in dating from other parts of the record, such as ceramics or coins. So for particularly grapevines and citrus and orchard cuttings in Pompeii, if you haven't got any, you're going to be earlier than the 2nd, 3rd BC. And if you've got a few percent, then you're in the 1st century, and above that, well above, you've already hit the 1st century AD. And that's because obviously as the the Roman period went on, diversity increases, consumption increases. Romans brought more and more woods back from Asia and Africa and consumed them. Talking a bit more about primary and secondary, because it's quite important to understand where things come from when you see them in a list. So your primary context, which might represent your hearth or your kitchen, your ritual deposit, you will often see, as I mentioned before, fruits or woods associated with ritual. But sometimes in a very mixed deposit, say the one where the actual 79 AD layer, which is very, very thick in Pompeii, up to 13 metres in some places, you've got all of the range of artefacts and ecofacts together, all smashed about with the pumice and the eruption debris. But then you'll find bits of grapevine like this one here, where it's literally just, you can see the scale there, a few centimetres long but very fine. And when I was recovering that grapevine, they were actually entire. So although everything's been mixed up in some of the contexts in Pompeii, in others you'll have perfectly preserved things. So for us, this grapevine was found in the house of the surgeon in a context where, for example, there wasn't any fresco in one of the main walls. And so we found this lovely grapevine. And so it was a possibility to consider that they were growing a grapevine across that wall rather than having had a fresco on it. So other examples of contexts that are mixed but still primary. This is charcoal in a lime mix. So somebody was making lime and basically the charcoal and the lime got mixed together in the bottom of the context. When we find red coloured charcoal, we look then for hammer scale with a magnet, and we will also be looking for wood that's a particularly hard, high heat value and probably very old wood. And then we've got most of our charcoal, which looks like this, and it's ubiquitous. It's in 2/3 of every deposit in any kind of urban environment in the classical period. So I'm going to hammer on about pollen a bit because I think we too often...
Can I just interrupt for a moment?
Yeah.
Just, you've had about 28 minutes. I don't know whether it's possible to start wrapping up.
Okay. Well, I'll skip the pollen then. What I was going to show you was... Oh, hell, sorry about that. The pollen comes from a long way and has different preservation characteristics to seeds. I don't know how to stop this down. what I wanted to explain to you was that there are a lot of problems with pollen studies at the moment because there's this idea we've got a lot of olive and vine everywhere, when in fact the pollen studies we've done around Pompeii just do not show that. So here's olive just here, and you've got far more of many other things. So the ancient historians have, or even just looking around, we thought there was a lot of pollen everywhere, a lot of olive everywhere, but in Campania, it doesn't seem like we actually had a lot of olive growing in the environment as opposed to grape. I think I should move away. Sorry, I completely lost track here. I can't see my... What I wanted to move on to was synthesizing things and talking about the fact that we have different levels of preservation, but we need to, in the end, model stuff, and we need to use our organic record as much as we do our inorganic record. So we've tended to concentrate on artistic things and buildings before, but organic things actually make up most of our record, even if we don't actually collect them very well yet. It's important to walk through a whole area and look at the ecology and how it works. It's important for everybody who's working on a site to do that. And when we're looking at charcoal, you don't need to look at that. In Pompeii, for example, we've got a lot of beach, and it comes ecologically from a much higher area than that. It didn't really grow lower down. Could have grown at about 600 meters, depending on what you think about the climate in the time period. So we know now with Pompeii that they went a long way to get most of their wood, because more than half of it is beach. So last of all, we get to doing things like modelling consumption and trying to understand how a footprint of a city was on its environment. And that sort of takes us back to where Jed started. And I look more at the data and more at the actual environment of individual sites. And I think what we need to try to do is make our sites match up. And so last of all, what does a good environmental report have in it? Well, it has all these things. It's got to start with the higher level geology and geomorphology studies. And it's got to try to date pollen. It's got to use well-dated pollen studies. And in the past, they were mostly straight line from 1 or 2 dates in a core. Now we do better Bayesian analyses of pollen cores, and we need to go back and redate some things. We should be integrating our historical sources, and we shouldn't be using so many statistics. If we don't have thousands and thousands of pieces of things, then we should not be using the amount of statistics that get used in archaeobotanical reports. And we really need to engage with people who do modelling and people who understand some of the climate aspects better, so that we can put what we find more in the frame of a regional rather than a city. Start with a site, go to a city, and go to a region. And I think that I've come from the bottom and gone back to the top again here. Anyway, thank you.